If you Google the definition of phantom pain, the first result will describe it as pain that feels like it's coming from a body part that's no longer there. This is naturally relevant to the story of Metal Gear Solid 5, just as the subtitles to all previous games in the series were. However, it's also eerily relevant to the game itself. Throughout the entire experience of the phantom pain, I couldn't help but shake the uncomfortable feeling that something was missing. The signature MGS charm and sense of humor were diminished to the point of being barely noticeable, and while I thoroughly enjoyed my experience with the gameplay, it managed to feel somewhat unpolished in comparison to its standalone prologue, Ground Zeroes. I did end up content with the game overall, but I couldn't shake that phantom pain, the longing for something that I knew was missing, a limb torn from the body of what should have been the ultimate Metal Gear Solid game. This is Metal Gear Solid 5, The Phantom Pain. It didn't surprise me at all to learn that this game is the product of near-endless developmental strife. Most of this sprouted from Hideo Kojima's ever-worsening relationship with Konami, who were relentless with pressure to release the game as soon as possible. This game feels rushed because it was. Ideas, story arcs, and even gameplay mechanics have incredible potential, but are just never fully realized. Just about everybody at this point has called this game unfinished, but there's a reason that word is so commonly used when describing this game. Usually with a Metal Gear Solid game, the story is front and center, but this game completely changes things up by putting the focus upon gameplay and shoving the story to the side. While I don't really have a problem with this approach, I do have a problem with just how sidelined the story is, but I'll get to that later. For now, I'll focus entirely on the gameplay. Unlike in the previous games where the journey was a single fairly linear path spanning the entire game, MGS5 is split up into 50 missions and 157 side ops. This is undoubtedly due to the major push for this game to be an open world experience, but I'll touch more on that later. For the largely revamped stealth gameplay on display here, I think the mission structure actually works pretty well. However, I feel like the missions themselves can end up pretty shallow. Most of them boil down to infiltrating one specific spot on the map, extracting a target, and getting out. It's exhilarating in the beginning, but it gets stale before long. This isn't helped by the fact that it feels like about half of these missions could have been cut without any loss. Most of these missions don't progress the story in any significant way, and that means that a lot of them end up feeling dull and unmemorable. The ones that are memorable are usually for all the wrong reasons, like Mission 29, Metallic Archaea, which is unforgettable for throwing away the fun stealth mechanics and forcing you into a boss arena, where the game turns into a generic third-person shooter that isn't any fun whatsoever. The missions get even worse in Chapter 2, where progression is a complete mess. You can't simply do all of the missions anymore. At points you'll be randomly gated off from unlocking the next mission, so you screw around doing side ops until it just randomly unlocks. Some of these main missions are completely optional repeats of older missions, and some of the side ops are mandatory. Progression is so needlessly convoluted that nobody can even agree on how it works. And this is all made even worse by the ending. Without talking about the story quite yet, the final chapter comes completely out of nowhere. There's no build-up whatsoever, you're just doing side ops, screwing around, and it randomly pops up. It's not even a final boss or anything like that, it just happens. I think one of the main things that hurts the missions in MGS5 is the open world structure of the game. Instead of the areas being sprawling fortresses, they all feel like smaller dots just scattered across a map. The sheer abundance of these areas detracts from the significance of each one. Had these areas not been hindered by the open world, they could be just as densely packed with details and possibilities as the areas in the first 4 games. Instead, everything here feels pretty basic. None of the areas were filled with any truly memorable moments. One moment in MGS3 that always stuck out to me was this one area right at the beginning. You can take the screen on in various different ways. Of course, there's the basic approach of simply taking out all the guards while remaining undetected, but thanks to a hint in the cutscene right beforehand, many players are going to notice that there's also this beehive, which you can shoot to make the guards scatter. And if you get caught, you may have to get your hands dirty in combat. And while you're doing that, you may notice that you can break the ropes on the bridge ahead of you, which makes the guards fly off to meet their demise at the bottom of the river below. However, this also puts you at a much greater risk of falling. And at the end, if you take a small venture off the main path, you can find an area with some extra ammo and items. In this one single screen, there are so many different ways to play the game, all of which feel like they were intended by the developers. It doesn't feel like you're taking advantage of something unintended. It feels like you're choosing one of many pathways that were laid out ahead of you. Areas like this are scattered everywhere throughout the first 4 installments, and they make each of those games unique and memorable in their own rights. Another moment that comes to mind here is this part in the prologue of MGS2. Your assignment is to take pictures of Metal Gear Bay from various different angles and send them to Otacon, and while that specific assignment does need to get done eventually, you can screw around for what feels like ages doing the exact opposite of that. You can send pictures of lewd posters, sleeping guards, the Commandant, and basically anything you can imagine to Otacon instead of what he asked for. You can even change some of the projectors here to display some interesting footage and distract the guards. And that's not even mentioning all the optional codec calls you can get along the way. This is all to say that this series has a remarkably high standard for attention to detail and opportunities for player self-expression. And I find this especially important to bring up here because I think this is an aspect in which MGS5 falls flat. The overall gameplay is often described as being limitless, and at first it truly feels that way. The opening hours do an incredible job of making you feel insignificant in comparison to the world around you, and it can be overwhelming. But once you start to get into the rhythm of the game, you'll start to realize just how similar a lot of these areas feel. Even once you unlock the Africa map, you're doing the exact same thing you did in Afghanistan. You can't understand their language at first, but it isn't long at all before you extract an interpreter to fix that problem. The strangest thing about the gameplay of MGS5 is that for as much as I'll complain about how repetitive it can be, there are plenty of options for you to approach things. In fact, there are so many different ways to go about infiltration in this game that I can imagine I don't even know half of them. It's truly incredible what you can do here. But the problem is that the game actively punishes you for taking an alternate approach. Don't get me wrong, you absolutely can do crazy things in this game, and you can totally get through all the missions in this fashion. But with the structure of this game, approaching the game that way is really going to hurt you in the long run. Let me explain. While most of the action here is on the field and missions and side ops like I described earlier, there's one more thing to do here that ties everything together, and that's Mother Base. At the end of Ground Zeroes, the Mother Base the Big Boss spent the entirety of Peace Walker building up is destroyed. Throughout the Phantom Pain, it's up to you to rebuild it from the ground up. After every mission, you hop on your helicopter to leave the area, and once you're in the helicopter, you'll almost always be hopping on your iDroid to manage Mother Base. This means everything, from staff to materials to development status. This is the only way you'll be able to get new weapons and upgrade existing ones, so if you want to make any significant advancements, you're going to need to keep good track of Mother Base. If you ask me, this is the biggest hindrance to the game. Getting new materials and staff members to help the development of Mother Base requires extracting them through the Fulton system from the enemy bases that you infiltrate. The best way to go about this is to tranquilize as many as you can from a distance and then get up closer once everyone is out to extract them. This is pretty fun and satisfying at first, but before long it gets tedious and mind-numbingly easy. After I developed the tranquilizer sniper, I often found myself neglecting to use it, instead heading into bases with nothing but a handgun simply so things would be more interesting. Trying to play the game in any other way is going to severely affect your intake of materials, and especially staff members. When an enemy dies, you can't extract it to help work at Mother Base. You can only do that when they're asleep or stunned. So if you want to go in guns blazing, or even just ignore enemies entirely, you can do that, but the game's going to make sure you regret it later since all your weapons are such a low grade they're practically worthless. Essentially, if your preferred method of play doesn't end in extraction, it's not valid. This was never an issue in older MVS games since they were all more linear. You could play any way you wanted and you would still be able to reach the next screen all the same. Here, since the game is so stretched out, you have to think about long-term consequences with every action you take. This makes for an incredibly interesting experience in its own right, and watching Mother Base gradually grow into a sprawling facility throughout the game is a lot of fun. But it also makes the game feel like it's at war with itself. The gameplay feels so tailored to letting the player experiment, yet the Mother Base system just doesn't allow that. However, let's just pretend for a second that Mother Base was never a part of the game. How does actual moment-to-moment gameplay stack up? Well, it's honestly fantastic. The options you have to approach things are incredibly varied. For instance, take Mission 10, Angel with Broken Wings. The whole idea here is that once you approach this busted-up castle, you'll see a truck driving off with the prisoner you're supposed to extract. So you go around the castle interrogating everyone, trying to get them to spill where the truck is going so you can catch up to it, grab the prisoner, and get him out. That's what the game expects you to do, but that's not the way you have to do it. Personally, I took it on a much different fashion. I saw the truck leaving, and instead of trying to figure out where it went, I'd simply reset and try to get there much faster. Quickly yet stealthily, I made my way over to the truck and stole the whole vehicle right in front of everyone. Obviously, I got spotted, but there was no way for them to catch up to me, so I took the prisoner out into the desert and extracted him in mere minutes. It felt incredible, and the whole game is full of opportunities like that. It's just a massive shame that Mother Base discourages you from taking them. Another huge complaint of mine with this game is how insanely long it is. This game took me a whopping 44 hours to complete, which is ridiculous for a game that's not an RPG. To put that in perspective, that's more than the rest of the series combined. For how repetitive the gameplay is forced to be, this game really has no reason to go on for as long as it does. It's a massive detriment to the game overall, and around Chapter 2, I was starting to just wish I was done already. Then the ending happened, and suddenly it felt like I didn't play enough. The way the game was structured, when I was 2 hours away from the credits rolling, I didn't even know I was getting close. The pacing in MGS5 is, to put it simply, a complete mess. Another aspect I found to be largely disappointing was the boss fights. With a few notable exceptions, none of them have personalities or names, and the gameplay is just as unmemorable. I already mentioned how atrocious Metallic Archaea is, but that's just one example. Some of these guys you can literally just walk right past. And as I mentioned before, there isn't even a final boss. Compare this to MGS 1 through 4, in which boss fights were some of the most memorable parts. MGS 3 especially handles these incredibly well, with each member of the Cobra unit having a memorable character and fight despite their brief appearance. I'll never forget the fights against the End, the Fury, the Sorrow, or really anyone in that game. In MGS5, it's just faceless drones. I should mention that MGS5 actually does have two really great boss fights. Quiet has an intense sniper battle across a sprawling open arena, and the Sahelanthropus fight is nothing but pure heart-pounding adrenaline. Honestly, the Sahelanthropus is quite possibly my favorite fight in the entire Metal Gear series. But that's not enough to salvage the rest of the boss fights, which are just garbage. There's one last thing that I want to talk about with the gameplay here, and that thing is Ground Zeroes. When I first played Ground Zeroes, I was really underwhelmed by its ridiculously short length, and thought of it as nothing more than a demo to the real MGS5 experience in the Phantom Pain. Looking back, I see it as everything the Phantom Pain should have been. It's only one mission long, but that one mission has more creative design than any mission in the main game. The first objective is to break Chico out of the cell, but you have to approach the cell completely undetected, so you have to be really careful going in. You're limited to only one set of weapons, so you have to be on your toes. Thankfully, the area is open enough to the point where you can approach the cell in any different way you want. Ground Zeroes isn't restricted by having to be in an open world. It is its own self-contained level, and that really let the designers go nuts with letting it be approached from any different direction. Anyways, after breaking out Chico and taking him to a safe space to get him out in the helicopter, it's time to track down Paz. You're in this wide open area with no clues except this audio tape. Listening to the tape, you hear a couple of sounds, like a gate closing and a flag. You have to use these context clues to put together where Chico was moved from and by extension, where Paz is currently being held. Honestly, this one part alone trumps anything in the Phantom Pain, but it gets better. After I got a vague idea of where Paz might be, I started making my way over to that part of the map, but it wasn't long before I came across this truck with its driver taking a quick break. As I readied my tranquilizer ready to take out the driver, I suddenly got an idea in my head. Instead of taking him out, I snuck into the back of the truck, let him finish his break, and let him take off back to base, completely unaware of his hidden passenger. Not only did this take me closer to Paz's location, but it let me bypass security completely undetected. Once I was inside the gate, I snuck my way inside, found Paz, and started to make my retreat back to the helicopter. However, it was around there that I got spotted. I made a mad dash back to the vehicle that I rode on the way in, shoved Paz in the truck, and booked it out of there. I made it back to the copter by the skin of my teeth, and it felt amazing. While I was disappointed by the credits rolling in only a few short minutes, I was beyond excited at the possibility of how this gameplay could be even further refined in the Phantom Pain. Unfortunately, what I didn't know at the time was that I had just experienced the best of what Metal Gear Solid 5 had to offer. When I played Ground Zeroes, I wasn't worried about extractions for 1 second. It never felt like I had to play the game in one specific way. I never felt burdened by the need to always pick up staff and materials. I was never frustrated by the open world. I never felt like I wasn't getting enough out of gameplay. I felt free to go about the mission how I wanted. If the Phantom Pain were about 10 to 15 Ground Zeroes types missions that progress in a linear fashion, I would absolutely love it. As it is, gameplay just feels like a jumbled mess. Okay, I think I've covered the gameplay pretty thoroughly, so now I want to talk about the other major aspect at play here, the story. I think even people that love this game tend to agree that the story is easily the worst part, and I fall in this camp as well. Oh, and by the way, major spoilers for this game inbound. Not that you're missing much, since MGS5 is complete filler that has very little to do with the rest of the series. Metal Gear Solid 5 is a story with amazing moments. The ride in the back of a truck with Skullface, the Sahelanthropus fight, Huey's exile, this incredible scene where Snake is forced to slaughter his own men at Mother Base to stop the spread of a fatal outbreak, and the ending twist where it's revealed you were never playing as Big Boss. When taken on their own, isolated from the rest of the story, these are all great scenes, but they don't flow together well at all. They're good moments, but overall, the story of MGS5 feels meandering. It doesn't know what it wants to do or where it wants to go. It just kind of floats around in limbo, sprouting new ideas out of nowhere until all of a sudden it comes to a close. At the end of it all, it feels like nothing happens. The story can't even seem to hold a main villain. Skullface is teased in Ground Zeroes, but then you barely ever see the dude until the end of Chapter 1. He's mentioned a couple times and makes a brief appearance early on, but he's never fully fleshed out. And even once you do finally see him, you end up killing him almost immediately, and his character feels so wasted. This leaves a perfect spot for the young Liquid Snake to fill the villain role during Chapter 2, but that simply never happens. It looks like it's gonna happen for a second here when he steals the Sahelanthropus, but he just flies off with it, never to be seen again. This plot thread is never resolved, so I'm just wondering what the hell happened to the Sahelanthropus? Why don't we ever see it again after this? If it were destroyed, that's one thing, but no, Liquid steals it while it's fully functioning and never utilizes it once. It feels like it's setting up to a climax that never happened, and it makes the narrative feel completely unfinished. There's also the ending twist to talk about here. I'll be honest, I really liked the idea of this. When it was revealed that Venom Snake was never Big Boss but instead your avatar, I was completely blown away. It's an ingenious twist that I genuinely never saw coming, and I really like the message they're trying to portray as well. The whole game, your avatar was filling a role to extend and preserve Big Boss's legacy, while the real Big Boss left to form his outer heaven that would later be seen in the original Metal Gear on the MSX2. Your avatar directly extends to you here. You weren't simply watching Big Boss being the legendary hero we already know he was. You were rebuilding Mother Base on your own, and cementing yourself into the legacy of Big Boss, a direct tie between the dedicated fan and the long-running series. In concept, I think this twist is genius. So what went wrong? I've complained about how the ending comes completely out of nowhere multiple times already, and I'm gonna do it again. This twist has absolutely nothing to do with the rest of the narrative. It comes completely out of nowhere and abruptly kills the little momentum the story had up to that point. Simply put, this twist adds absolutely nothing to the story. It's completely worthless to the Metal Gear narrative as a whole. MGS5's story was already total filler, but this final twist only confirms that it has no reason to exist. Having played the entire series, I can't help but feel like Kojima wanted MGS4 to be the last game. It wraps up the entire franchise phenomenally with no loose ends, and it sets up a situation that nothing can follow. Peace Walker was on a handheld and wasn't being sold as a true mainline game, and it adds more depth to the character of Big Boss, so I can excuse that game being relatively insignificant in the grand scheme of the franchise. Also, it helps that the story is actually, good. With MGS5, this is a full-on numbered title in a series that is heavily reliant on the story. Pushing the story to the side does not fly here. Alright, I think I've complained about this game enough at this point, so let's wrap this up. At the end of the day, is the game good? Well, kind of? It's so weird to say, but after harshly criticizing this game for the last 18 minutes, I really can't bring myself to call this a bad game. Oddly enough, I find this game really endearing. I genuinely did have a lot of fun with it, and for every glaring issue that I have, saying I hate the game couldn't be further from the truth. This is a very similar experience I had with Persona 3 when I played that last year. I have way more problems with Persona 3 than I do praises, but I distinctly remember having a lot of fun with that game. I won't get into that game right now because that's a whole different discussion for a whole different time, but the similarities here were too striking to not bring up. Can I recommend Metal Gear Solid 5? Yeah, I can. For as fundamentally flawed as nearly every aspect of it is, it's a fun time that you can pour dozens of hours into. But I'd be lying to myself if I didn't admit this was the worst MGS game by a landslide. The Metal Gear Solid series has a rock-solid reputation. The original Metal Gear Solid is flawed, but still pretty good. Sons of Liberty is a masterpiece. Snake Eater isn't far behind, and Guns of the Patriots is an imperfect but incredible finale. Metal Gear Solid 5, while not exactly bad, isn't particularly good either. I do think it's worth playing once, but I doubt I'll ever be revisiting this one.